I'm excited to be talking to you today. I've always been interested in menus, the way we talk about food. Even as a kid, I would draw up fictional menus of restaurants and force my mom to order, which was especially difficult because I only ate like 4 items at a time, and you could only describe chicken tenders and mozzarella sticks so many times. Here's a menu that I helped contribute to as a 7-year-old for my dad's birthday. My contribution was called Hot Dogs Teddy with Herculean buns. Apparently I've always had a flair for the grandiose menu description, but I think even then I had some inkling, some implicit understanding that the way we talk about food tells us more than what we're about to eat, but something about who we are and who we aspire to be. Menus are more than a list. They can be an art form, a promise, a sales pitch, even a protest. Excuse me, a protest. Unlike a cookbook, which is speaks to the private and the personal, the menu somehow it addresses the outward persona, and that makes the language of menus a particular way of presenting food for the public self, speaking to our ambitions and anxieties as a culture and a society, which makes them a particularly revealing cultural document worthy of studying. So now there are many stories one could track through menus, but tonight I only have 30 minutes. So I'm going to focus on tracing the evolution of American fine dining menu styles using examples from notable San Francisco restaurants, and then discuss the special vocabulary of menus to illustrate how menus offer a window into the connection between food, culture, and class in America. But to help organize tonight's offerings, I've drawn up a little 4-course menu of my own. So first we have an aperitif, a little brief teaser about the origins of the restaurant menu in the French Revolution. Then we're going to have a quick foray into a quick outline of the history of the first 125 years of American menu styles. Then I'm going to discuss the socioeconomic implications of 2 different menu vocabulary by comparing 2 very different steak dishes on menus. And finally, I'm going to end with a brief comment on the current artistic ambitions of contemporary menus. And I think that should paint a pretty powerful portrait of the menu as a flexible, powerful cultural document. First, course 1, Parisian history. To understand the menu's present, we need to know its past. And that past traces all the way back to 18th century France. The first restaurant, according to legend, popped up in Paris in 1765 when a soup seller named Boulanger made the radical decision to sell a sheep's foot in his broth and was sued by the catering guild. At the time, the food world in Paris was ruled by the medieval guild system. So there were 25 food guilds which each had an exclusive license to sell a particular item. So the members of the pastry guild were forbidden by law to sell soup or become a butcher, and vice versa. Now Boulanger ultimately lost his lawsuit, but menus really emerged as a popular cultural institution after the French Revolution for 2 key reasons. The first is the revolution abolished the guild system, so it allowed individuals to pursue whatever craft interests them. And second, which is a blunt but powerful reason, all the king chefs were suddenly unemployed. And they were looking for work, and restaurants offered steady employment. Throughout the early 1800s, the restaurant and the French Revolution were indelibly linked. For the rest of the world, this strange new social institution of the restaurant became the symbol of the individualist spirit of the revolution. And it's important to note that restaurants ushered in a radically different style of service. At the time, people didn't really eat outside of their house unless they were traveling. And in that case, they would usually eat in an inn. And an inn, the dominant service style was called table d'hôte, or the host's table, where the host would serve all guests at the same time, the same dishes, at the same table, which presented certain problems because maybe the person next to you took all the best bits of the meat. Alternatively, in restaurants, each guest had a small private table and could eat at whatever hour they liked. And most importantly, at restaurants, for the first time, a new ingredient was on the menu: choice. The vehicle of that choice was the printed menu. And in a certain sense, the defining innovation of restaurants was the printed menu, because unlike table d'hôte, you couldn't see the food in front of you. You had to have some sort of description to know what you were getting into. And it's hard to appreciate how strange this menu was now, but it just baffled the public. I guess the equivalent would be sort of like trying to teach your grandparents how to Instagram. but many people thought it was a newspaper, didn't know what to make of it. Here's a cartoon, a contemporary cartoon, showing a Parisian ordering India rubber because he didn't want to admit that he couldn't read the menu. And some of the grandiose descriptions, like chicken merengue, just sort of baffled people. And reading the menu became a novelty that swept across the Parisian cultural scene. It featured in plays, it featured in Stendhal and Balzac novels, and countless travel diaries. And one group who was particularly smitten with the restaurant craze was American and British travelers, who were just obsessively described these restaurants in their correspondence in the early 1800s, and who demanded it for themselves. And that brings us to our second course, Menu à l'Américaine. In the 1840s and 50s, the idea of the restaurant migrated to the US, starting in hotels in big cities. Now, before restaurants, there were public eateries in the late 18th century America, so-called restaurators in Boston, public eating houses in New York, but the concept of the restaurant as a space for the individual eater hit the US in the 1840s and spread like wildfire in 1850 with the rise of the middle class and suburbanization of certain big cities. And nowhere did it spread more quickly than San Francisco. It's an interesting fact that in the second half of the 19th century, there were a greater number of restaurants per capita in the West than eastern cities. And the reason is fairly obvious, because the men who came west seeking fortunes during the gold rush in 1849 did not bring families with them and didn't know how to cook. So there was an immediate economic need for good cooking. And if you were smart at that time, you didn't mine for gold, you opened a business. And a lot of restaurateurs immediately became successful. That's a picture of the Long Wharf in 1850. Here is the earliest menu we have a picture of in San Francisco, called the Ward House from 1849. And this is one of the original destination restaurants in San Francisco. Sorry, the picture's a little blurry. And for your reference, at the time, $1 is worth about $28 today. So it was a $28 egg at that time. Restaurants from the beginning were linked with social status. Miners would celebrate when they struck gold by going to Ward House. And men would often mail home restaurant menus home to their families back east to show that they were being successful. And that's actually how we have a lot of these menus. You can see at the time the options were quite plain and sort of derivative of British cuisine. So it was just beef, or fresh California eggs, or potatoes boiled. It was clear. And at that time, there was no real American cuisine. Cuisine in America meant that you went outside, you killed something, you boiled or baked it, and then you put it on a plate. That was California cuisine at the time. But when you reached for fine cuisine, you reached to Europe, and particularly French cuisine. A number of talented French chefs moved to San Francisco after the revolutions of 1848 swept across Europe and ended their positions working for the aristocracy. So there was a sudden influx of fine French restaurants in the city at that time. And the most famous one, undoubtedly, was the Old Poodle Dog, which was the iconic fine dining restaurant for the first 75 years of San Francisco's history. French was the default cuisine and language for American fine dining in the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th. But this French was a little imperfect. American tongues couldn't quite pronounce some of the French terms, so a sort of bastardized vocabulary arose that mixed English and French. And the best illustration of this is the bastardization of the Old Poodle Dog's name itself, which according to legend was born when miners mispronounced the original name Le Poulet d'Or as Old Poodle Dog. There were two major menu formats in the sort of pre-World War I era. The standard format was a single sheet cardstock, often adorned with kind of simple illustrations or simple graphics you can see on the left. And then the other popular one was an ornate booklet that was decorated with silken cords or colorful fringed trim. And here are some examples. You can see they're quite distinctive and very different than what we do today. But then a seismic event reshaped American restaurant and menu history. Prohibition. Most French restaurants just went out of business during this time because French chefs needed wine to cook like the vast majority of their dishes. So many French chefs went back to France, and in its place, a quintessentially American phenomenon arose: the soda fountain and the fast food restaurant. That's a story for another talk. The next major change in the fine dining menu occurred in the 50s. When a new generation of fine dining restaurants emerged in post-war America. In my opinion, this was really truly the first golden age of American restaurants and the golden age of menu design. And Original Joe's has generously lent us a menu from each of their decades. You can see on the back table from 1944 up until the 80s. And you can kind of see how the style changed. But here we see a very plain 1944 menu during World War II rations. Then immediately it bursts into the 50s with color and graphic panache. But these menus also had a couple of very notable linguistic trends. The most important one is menus get longer. So here is the Tadich Grill, which is the oldest California restaurant. In 1922 versus 1961, the number of dishes jumped from 75 to 121, and the number of words leaped from 254 to 537. What was a dish simply called lettuce with A in 1922 becomes the mixed green salad with French dressing. And that's where we start to see the standard descriptive menu language start to form. But perhaps the most striking trend of the period is the continental style, exemplified by the Blue Fox, which was a San Francisco institution for 50 years and a favorite of Marilyn Monroe, Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra. Many writing guides at the time suggested that restaurant owners continentalize their menus, which meant adding superfluous French and Italian words. So le steak or veal haché en casserole. And studies found that expensive menus use French 5 times more than cheaper menus. So it was just a class indicator. And another particularly egregious practice was naming dishes after sort of profound, aristocratic-sounding French names. So we have pepperoni Don Salvatore, frog legs au Grimaldi, breast of chicken escoffier. There is no Grimaldi, actually. So some of these are just renaming something to add a little bit of European flair. And I looked it up, and it turns out chicken escoffier is just breaded chicken breast. Chicken tenders, in other words. So I should have been selling. I didn't know when I was pitching my menu to my mom when I was 7 that I should have called it chicken escoffier instead of chicken tenders. But yes.
You made a mistake. Grimaldi is the ruling house of Monaco. That would have been based on Grace Kelly's marriage to Prince Rainier.
Were they a cook? Well, I apologize. So this, I will say that they named it for real European aristocrats, and perhaps Mr. Grimaldi was a fantastic chef of frog legs, but
he might love frog legs.
But I think that we see here the overall arc. Here's some more examples of it. The overarching kind of sentiment of this style is that a dish is inherently tastes better if it's in French. that there's, and it kind of bespeaks a certain lack of confidence in American cuisine. It's sort of it's an inferiority complex that cherries just can't match the flavor of Chez and all of that changed with Chez Panisse. When Alice Waters opened Chez Panisse in 1972, she really reinvented the zeitgeist of American eating. This was a dinner in 1976 that Jeremiah Tower, who was her first chef de cuisine and went on to become a very important San Francisco chef, credited as, quote, starting the revolution in American cooking. And you can see that revolution in the language. We have Spengler's Tamales Bay Blue Point oysters. We see Monterey Bay prawns, preserved California-grown grease from Sebastopol. We have mountain pears from the San Francisco Farmers Market. while the continental style bespoke a lack of confidence in American cuisine, Chez Panisse just revels in California's gastronomic splendor, replacing Italian aristocrats or French queens with Sonoma farmers. And this new menu style also had a couple key literary traits. First and foremost, a strong sense of place and local geography, which you can see every single item is sourced, and putting California places on the map over European ones. And the second is a syntax. Descriptive phrases replace garish dish titles, where we have these lists cataloging the food's ingredients, origins, and preparations, replacing these overwrought European phrases. And this really was a watershed moment, a sort of declaration of American culinary independence, if you will, when American cuisine started taking pride in its own natural bounty rather than kowtowing to European tradition. Now, this presentation is not about Alice Waters. I could go on for many minutes, but the important menu trend is this gourmand catalogs format became the new standard style for fine dining menus for the last 30 to 40 years, and indeed many restaurants still follow it today. But that brings us to our third course, A Tale of Two Steaks. And at this point, I'm going to transition from history to more of a linguistic literary criticism. Because after the Chez Panisse revolution, we start to see two distinct types of menus develop in America, each with their own vocabulary and style, that reveal the attitudes of a particular social class. And the best way to dramatize this difference is not to tell you about it, but to show you. So here is the first dish from a restaurant called Masa. Grilled calotte of Japanese Kobe beef, truffle-scented saucisson de crevette, braised chard, glazed cipollini, lobster bordelaise, truffle cream. You can just feel the luxury ooze out of the adjective. Now here's a slightly different style of steak dish. This is from TGIF's. Petite sirloin. This mouth-watering 6-ounce filet style cut, tender black Angus sirloin is fire grilled, topped with garlic butter and served with your choice of two sides. I feel like that is the voice they want me to pitch it in. But a couple of differences are immediately apparent. The first is diction. Masa's dish is filled with long, technical, obscure, foreign terms with multiple syllables, while TGIF's is rife with these sort of vague, optimistic filler. And the syntax and the style and syntax is different. Masa's steak is a catalog of luxury ingredients, just commas, no prepositions, no conjunctions, as though saying, here are all the expensive items you're buying, with absolutely no filler, not even an and or a with to dilute the value. Well, the TGIF is all filler. It's a full paragraph, kind of written in a very conversational style, as almost a personal sales pitch telling a story how the steak comes to you. So let's look at a couple more examples that will make these distinctions even more clear. So here we have an Outback center-cut sirloin, center cut for tenderness, lean, hearty, and full of flavor, seasoned and seared. Center cut filet mignon from Olive Garden, 6 ounces of premium filet, seasoned with Italian herbs, and grilled to perfection. You don't see a lot of perfection doesn't often pop up on the French Laundry's menu. But I think a couple things immediately jump out. That there's an emphasis on size. Medium-priced menus need to tell you exactly how big it's going to be, and they're trying to reassure you it's going to be hearty, and it's going to be filling, and it's going to meet all of your expectations. There's a focus on choice. You don't get a choice at a fine dining restaurant. Here, every person gets a steak grilled to your liking. You get your choice of sides. We also have an emphasis on service, the fact you're being served, which is a sort of emotional kind of reassurance. And the most obvious one is just the profusion of vague positive words, tender, full of flavor, grilled to perfection. And studies have shown that expensive menus have fewer words, fewer but longer words, and medium-priced menus have shorter words but more of them. And the larger distinction is that medium-priced menus emphasize, I would say, experience, and expensive menus emphasize investment. And it's just a fundamentally different way of approaching dining. And what's interesting is that these linguistic patterns have economic consequences. A pioneering study by a Stanford linguist named Dan Jurofsky analyzed menus from over 6,000 restaurants and 650,000 dishes. And it found that a menu's vocabulary correlates with its price. So we see here that expensive menus mention the provenance of their food 15 times more often. Each extra letter and average word length is an 18-cent increase in price. And each time you see a vague filler word like delicious or perfection, it's a 9% decrease in price. And another interesting point of comparison is the geography on menus. Here we see, these are the locations I've pulled from Michael Mina's tasting menu, which is a local one-star Michelin restaurant. And we see the names of several high-status farms and renowned international gastronomic kind of provenances. Russian Osetra caviar, Yemenite-style ribeye, Perigord black truffle, Japanese A5 wagyu. It seems that the whole world's at the diner's fingertips. They're able to go from Japan to Russia to Yemen and then still stay in touch with their local community. It's sort of cosmo-local kind of perspective that I think bespeaks the sort of comfort of the kind of jet-setting upper class. Now let's look at the geography of a slightly less prestigious menu. Red Lobster. So we have Carrot Isle Jumbo Shrimp. We have the Yucatan Tilapia, the Bar Harbor Lobster Bake, the Cheddar Bay Biscuits, and Salmon New Orleans, which is described as, this dish will send your mouth on a trip to the Big Easy. So we see that names are no less prominent, but serve a very different role. They have no interest in, Cheddar Bay doesn't exist, neither does Carrot Isle, but it does seem like the kind of place that maybe Cheddar Bay would make good biscuits. And even when they use an actual location like New Orleans, it's not to refer to any concrete location, but some sort of emotional association or mood that is associated with that place. And I think it bespeaks the way these menus try to target the sort of lower middle class or middle class customers who maybe can't take that trip to New Orleans, while the person who goes to Michael Mina could easily afford all those things. And so there's something about it serves a very different role. So this is a graph that Jarofsky did, where he found that the word delicious appears on fine dining menus or correlates with the price. But perhaps the most interesting thing to look at is words that never appear in fine dining. And Jarofsky did some very interesting work that looks at words that just that frequently never appear. So we see delicious, fresh, creamy, premium, gourmet, ripe, real. Now some of these have obvious explanations. The French Laundry does not need to tell you that the crab is real or that the salad is right. It's assumed. But the fact that the Applebee's menu emphasizes they have fresh salad speaks to the kind of fundamental status anxiety that defines the psychology of kind of a middle-class restaurant and a middle-class customer. But yet the single most insightful finding in Jarofsky's study is the absence of the word you. Is that this is the word you and your does never appear on fine dining menus. Expensive restaurants are 7 times more likely to talk about the chef's choice and 3 times less likely to mention the diner's choice. While commercial restaurants cater everything to the whims of the diner, your choice, your liking, have it your way, presenting the diner with a bounty of seemingly infinite choices. Yet when you look at the hundreds of dishes on something like the Olive Garden's menu, and you look closely, you think, yeah, they may have 20 types of chicken, but they all taste the same. Yeah. It's the simulation of choice without the reality of it. And on the other hand, the fine dining restaurant doesn't care what you want. The chef's choice is the only one that matters. And any self-respecting customer knows your vulgar preferences cannot intrude on the chef's artistry. And this highlights a counterintuitive trend, that the more expensive and fancy a restaurant, the less choice it has. And the more choice it has, the cheaper it is. It turns out choice is for the cheap. Which brings us to the final development in the menu's literary evolution, and the final course in tonight's talk, the chef as artist. The logical conclusion of this sort of anti-choice ethos is what I call the Minimalist Menu. Here is a notorious menu from 11 Park Madison, which was ranked as the best restaurant in the world at one time. Starting in the 90s, the tasting menu format became the de facto style for all the world's best restaurants, where the diner did not order anything, but simply deferred to see what the chef's best offering was. And when you no longer need to make a choice, it doesn't really matter if the dish descriptions are helpful or accurate. So menus take on a very different role. And we see today among the younger generation of sort of cutting edge Michelin star restaurants, this minimalist style has really taken off. But this evolution is best seen by comparing the change in the 11 Park Madison's menu from 2009 to 2010 after being named one of the world's 50 best restaurants. So they were put on the list in 2009 and they suddenly decided to change from a traditional style into this. And not all of the dishes are quite so minimal. Here are some other dishes that I have pulled from local San Francisco restaurants that use this style. We have crab, kiwi, buttermilk, radish and butter, pistachio, fennel, and chartreuse, omija and olive oil, my personal favorite, aged short rib, flowers, asparagus. So we see a couple things, a couple trends pop up, a couple key stylistic features. There's a flattened grammar, so there's no sense of proportion or relation. You don't know how the radish or the butter relate to each other, or what role, or if the flowers are really as big a part of the dish as the asparagus. A radically simple vocabulary that specifically eradicates the sort of erudite, glossy culinary technique words, and also gets rid of the typical class signifiers like Perrigo or Wagyu. And also no dish titles, which is perhaps the most interesting thing. Each item is so unique, it's not a rendition of a previous recipe. It can only be experienced in this way. And the overriding message is just trust the chef. Anything I do with radish and butter is going to be great. I remember I went to a restaurant called Rich Table where they told me the dessert was strawberries and avocado. And I asked what it was. It's like, all I can tell you is that it's amazing. And that is the attitude. That it's almost it makes it better to not reveal what's coming because it intensifies the experience. And the other key distinction is the sort of lyric flourishes, where we see that dishes are reduced down to a couple of words, but some of the words are chosen more for evocative potential than descriptive accuracy. So adding the flowers, or seed and grain, or golden, or sunflower, we see a lot of flowers and colors and these evocative images, which highlights that the chef is no longer defined by technique but creation. They're not glazing, they don't want to be known for how they glaze carrots, but how they create like a larger work of art, perhaps. And this sensibility is strengthened by the menu's distinct format. So each menu at one of these minimalist menus is printed individually on fine press letterhead, and you can see we have a menu from Venu and Atelier Crenn, which are both 3 Michelin star restaurants here, and they often have the diner's name engraved on it, and it's kept as a memento of that occasion. And it becomes apparent why this is important when you compare it to something like the Olive Garden's menu, where every single margin is just crowded with another dish trying to sell you something. And the minimalist menu just leaves a blank space, so there's room for the diner to project their thoughts and feelings and imagination. The physical format and design invite you to engage with the text using a very different scrutiny, perhaps similar to poems. Here's a poem that I just pulled from Poetry Magazine. You see that the spacing is similar. It's asking you to pay attention to the language. And this, and sometimes the menu literally becomes a poem, as in Atelier Crenn, which is San Francisco's most recently crowned free Michelin star restaurant. And rather than having a traditional menu, they leave a poem on the table and encourage guests to imagine what the dish would be. So your first course is, summer has come with its warm breeze. And then you have dotting the fragrant flora as your final course. And this style asks you to engage with the language and the experience in a totally fundamentally different way. While the gourmand kind of fine dining style asks you to pause and savor each luxurious ingredient, appreciate the fact you're about to enjoy Osetra caviar. The minimalist menu, or what I sometimes call the haiku menu, speaks to our greater aspirations. It whets our imagination, which underlines how cuisine is entering a new phase in its cultural evolution, from a craft into an art. Today, people who might have attended the symphony or opera 30 years ago now go to a Michelin star restaurant for their thrill of cultural sophistication. And this haiku menu is the best evidence the chefs sense this, and they're embracing this existential shift, transcending labels, dish names, the dirty language of saute pans and kitchen tools. This haiku menu declares that their food is so unique that it cannot be described, but only experienced. In other words, it's art. And on that note, I will conclude with a short anecdote. A few years ago, I ate dinner with my college roommate Ricky, who is here tonight, at a restaurant called Astor. And after the meal, our menus were returned to us with our check, oddly enough, folded into the shape of a swan. And that paper bird may be the perfect accidental symbol for the menu's transformational literary power, embodying how the menu gave cuisine the wings to fly from an artisan past into an artistic future. Thank you so much.
If we are open for questions, first, thanks, it's absolutely great lecture. I have a question. When you discussed a little bit the typographic differences between menus, but